He protected her child with his body. Now the Queen wants him HFY. Ethan Carter had always been a soldier. He had been trained to face danger head-on, to protect those who needed it, and to do his duty without question. But nothing in his training had prepared him for the alien world he was now stationed on, a planet caught in the midst of a brutal war. The planet's surface was scarred with the marks of constant battles, its skies filled with smoke from burning cities. He had seen many things in his years as a peacekeeper, but nothing like this. The mission was simple enough: help the Zarithians, a proud and warlike species, maintain some sense of order in their chaotic world. The humans were there to keep the peace, but in reality they were outnumbered and outgunned. Zarithians were not known for their kindness, and Ethan had to tread carefully. He had seen the alien warriors in action, tall, strong, with skin like thick armor. They had no need for diplomacy, only brute force. One evening, after a long day of securing a settlement from marauders, Ethan was returning to his post when he heard the sound of explosions in the distance. His heart sank. He knew what it meant. The enemy was attacking again. As he hurried to gather his team, a Zarithian soldier intercepted him. "It's the princess," the soldier said, his voice filled with urgency. "She's under attack." Princess Althara. Ethan had heard her name before. She was young, intelligent, and had taken a more diplomatic path than most of her people. She was often seen as a symbol of hope, someone who believed in peace. But no one in the settlement had expected her to be caught in the crossfire. Without hesitation, Ethan ran toward the commotion. His mind raced, trying to think of a plan. The Zarithians had their own warriors, so why would the princess need a human soldier to protect her? But this wasn't the time for questions, only action. He knew he had to move fast. As he rounded the corner of a building, he saw her. Althara was surrounded by a group of enemy soldiers, each one armed and ready for battle. The princess, standing tall despite the danger, held a weapon, but it was clear that she was outmatched. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he assessed the situation. He could hear the sound of boots pounding the earth, the clashing of metal against metal. Then, to his horror, he saw a small figure, Althara's child, Rylia, standing beside her. The young alien girl was barely more than a child, no older than 7 or 8 in human years. She was caught in the open, too vulnerable to defend herself. Ethan didn't think, he acted. Drawing his sidearm, he charged forward, shouting to the Zarithian soldiers to get away from the princess. The sound of gunfire filled the air as he fired at the attackers. His aim was true, taking down one enemy soldier after another. The remaining enemies hesitated for just a moment, enough time for Ethan to reach the princess and her child. He shoved Althara out of the way, throwing himself in front of Rylia. A blast of energy grazed his side, but Ethan barely felt it as he turned his body to shield the child. He felt the heat of another blast on his back, but he didn't move. His only focus was keeping the child safe. Althara, realizing the danger, lunged forward to protect her son, but it was Ethan who had already moved in front of her, his body taking the brunt of the attack. The pain was sharp, but Ethan didn't falter. His training had prepared him for physical pain, but nothing had prepared him for the instinct to protect that burned within him now. He knew he couldn't hold out forever. The enemy soldiers were relentless, and their fire was becoming more accurate. He had to get them out of there fast. With his body still blocking the child from the worst of the attack, he gestured to Althara, signaling her to move. "Run!" he shouted, his voice strained. "Get her out of here!" But the princess hesitated. She didn't want to leave him, and Ethan could see it in her eyes. She wanted to fight, wanted to stay by his side. But she was no soldier. She was a leader, and her duty was to her people, especially her child. Ethan knew she couldn't stay. "Go!" he barked again, his voice firm. His heart raced as he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Finally, Althara seemed to snap out of her hesitation. She grabbed Rylia by the hand, pulling her toward safety. The princess looked back at Ethan, her face filled with a mix of gratitude and fear. But she obeyed, and they ran, disappearing into the smoke-filled night. Ethan, now alone, turned to face the remaining attackers. He was out of ammunition, and his side was burning with pain from the earlier blast. He could feel his strength fading, but he wasn't done yet. The sound of enemy footsteps grew closer, and Ethan knew it was time to make his final stand. With his last burst of energy, he charged toward the nearest soldier, knocking him to the ground and using the soldier's own weapon to take down another. But the numbers were overwhelming. Ethan was fast, but not fast enough. A sudden blow to the back of his head knocked him to the ground, his vision swimming as the world spun around him. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the image of Althara and Rylea, safe, thanks to him. When Ethan regained consciousness, the first thing he felt was the unbearable pain coursing through his body. His side ached where the blast had grazed him, and his head throbbed as though someone had taken a hammer to it. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he might pass out again. But something kept him awake, a driving force inside him that refused to let him fall into darkness. He tried to move, but the pain was too much. His body felt heavy, unresponsive, as if it were no longer his own. A low groan escaped his lips as he opened his eyes and tried to focus on his surroundings. The world around him was unfamiliar, a stark, cold room with walls made of a material he couldn't recognize. The floor beneath him was hard and smooth. "Where am I?" he muttered to himself, his voice weak. A figure moved toward him from the shadows. Ethan's heart raced, fear creeping into his chest as he instinctively reached for his sidearm, but his hand found nothing. He was defenseless. "Stay calm," a voice said. It was soft, but it held a commanding presence. "You're safe now." Ethan squinted, finally making out the shape of the figure in front of him. A tall Zarithian warrior stood before him, strong, tall, and imposing. But there was something in her eyes, a kind of quiet respect that didn't match the usual aggression he had seen from her people. "Where am I?" Ethan asked again, his voice hoarse. The Zarithian nodded toward the far side of the room where he could see the flicker of a fire. "You are in the royal palace," she explained. "You're being treated for your wounds. The queen ordered it." Ethan frowned, trying to remember what had happened. The last thing he recalled was being knocked out after protecting Althara and Rylea. His heart skipped a beat at the thought of the princess and her child. He had done his best to shield them, but had they escaped? Had they made it out of the ambush alive? "Where's Althara, Rylea?" he asked urgently. The Zarithian warrior's expression softened. "The princess and the child are safe," she said. "They are in the royal chambers. The queen has ordered extra protection for them. You saved them, human. You saved their lives." Ethan relaxed slightly, a weight lifting off his chest. Althara and Rylea were safe. That was all that mattered. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. But even as relief washed over him, questions swirled in his mind. Why was he here? What had happened to the enemy soldiers? Before he could ask any more questions, the door to the room opened, and another Zarithian stepped inside. This one was different. She was not dressed in the heavy armor of a soldier. Instead, she wore regal robes, her golden skin glowing in the dim light. Her eyes locked onto Ethan, and for the first time he saw a look of genuine interest in the eyes of a Zarithian. "You're awake," the queen said, her voice both strong and soft. It was a voice that demanded attention, yet somehow it held a warmth that Ethan hadn't expected from a ruler of such a fierce race. Ethan tried to sit up, but the pain in his side flared up again. He winced and fell back against the bed. "Where am I?" he asked once more, his voice barely above a whisper. The queen nodded, stepping closer. "You're in my palace. We've been tending to your wounds since you were brought here. The enemy was driven off, but you were badly injured. You're fortunate to be alive." The queen's gaze was steady as she studied him, her golden eyes never wavering. Ethan couldn't help but feel a strange mix of awe and unease under her scrutiny. He had faced countless dangers in his life, but none like this, none like standing before a queen who was both an enemy and a potential ally. What happened?" Ethan asked, his voice weak but determined. "The soldiers you fought off were part of a larger force," the queen explained, her tone level. "They came for the princess, but thanks to your actions, they failed. You risked your life for her child without hesitation. I've never seen anything like it." Ethan looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. He had only done what anyone would do. He had protected a defenseless child. But he knew that Zarithians saw things differently. To them, honor and strength were everything. Sacrificing oneself for someone else, especially an alien, was not something most would understand. "Why did you do it?" the queen asked, her voice softer now. "Why protect a child who is not your own, you humans? You are not like us." Ethan struggled to find the right words. He wasn't sure if he could explain it. The Zarithians didn't value compassion the way humans did, but he had to try. "I didn't think about it," Ethan said slowly. "I saw a child in danger and I had to act. It's what we do, I guess, protect those who can't protect themselves. It's what makes us human." The queen regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Ethan couldn't tell what she was thinking. He wondered if she saw him as weak, if she thought that his compassion for a child made him less of a warrior, less of a soldier. Finally, she spoke again. "You saved the princess and her child. That alone has earned you respect here. But I have questions for you, human." Ethan's heart beat faster. He had a feeling he wasn't going to like the questions she was about to ask. "Why did you do it?" she repeated. "You could have stayed hidden. You could have let the Zarithians handle the situation. But instead, you put yourself in the line of fire for a child you don't even know." Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to explain himself. He had never had to justify his actions before, but something about the way the Queen looked at him made him feel as though she needed to understand. "I couldn't just stand by," he said finally. "In the end, it's about something bigger than all of us. It's about doing what's right even when it's hard, even when it seems like there's no hope." The Queen's eyes softened just slightly, a flicker of something akin to respect passing through them, but she didn't say anything more. She simply turned and began walking toward the door. "You will stay here for the time being," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have much to consider, and you will have a part to play in the future of this war." Ethan watched as the Queen left the room, her footsteps echoing in the silent space. He was left alone with his thoughts, the weight of her words sinking in. The Queen had said that he would have a part to play in the war. What did that mean? Was she offering him a chance to fight alongside the Zarithians? Or was it something darker, something more dangerous? Ethan had no answers, only questions. But one thing was certain: his actions had changed everything. He had gone from being just another human soldier to someone important in the eyes of the Zarithian Queen. Whether that would be a blessing or a curse, only time would tell. But as he lay back against the bed, trying to fight off the pain that still pulsed through his body, Ethan couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. He had protected a child, and now he would have to protect the future. The days that followed were a blur for Ethan. His body ached from the wounds he'd sustained during the ambush, but it wasn't just the physical pain that weighed heavily on him. It was the uncertainty, the questions that kept swirling in his mind unanswered. Why had the Queen taken such an interest in him? Was it because of his actions, or was there something more? As he lay in the quiet, cool chambers of the royal palace, Ethan couldn't help but wonder what had come of Althara and Rylia. He had saved them, but at what cost? He had no idea what had happened to the enemy forces, or whether they had come back for another attack. All he knew was that the Zarithians had fought back, and the princess and her child were safe. A few days passed, and Ethan was slowly getting back on his feet. He had been given medical care for his injuries, and the pain had begun to subside. Still, the quiet isolation of his room left him with plenty of time to think. Then one morning, as he sat on the edge of his bed, a soft knock came at the door. "Come in," Ethan called, his voice hoarse but strong. The door creaked open, and in stepped a Zarithian warrior, her tall form casting a shadow across the floor. It was the same warrior who had first spoken to him when he had awoken in the palace. She was standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "You are to follow me," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. Ethan stood up slowly, stretching his sore limbs. He had no idea where he was being led, but the warrior's presence made it clear that the Queen had ordered this. He followed her through the labyrinth of the palace, which seemed far grander than anything he had expected from a species known for its warrior culture. The walls were decorated with intricate carvings of past battles and symbols of power. The air was thick with the scent of strange flowers and spices. Finally, they reached a large chamber, a vast hall with high ceilings and pillars that reached toward the sky. At the far end, seated on an elaborate throne, was the Zarithian Queen. Ethan had seen her before, but never in such a commanding setting. Her robes were embroidered with symbols of her status, and her golden eyes shone with an intensity that made him feel both small and powerful at the same time. As he entered, the Queen's gaze flicked over him, as if measuring him, weighing his every move. She gestured for him to approach, her hand graceful yet firm. "Ethan Carter," she said, her voice ringing out through the chamber. "You've caused quite a stir among my people." Ethan stopped a few paces from her throne, unsure of what to say. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," he said. "I just did what I had to." The Queen studied him for a long moment. There was something in her eyes, a quiet curiosity, but also a hint of something deeper. "You did more than that. You proved that humans are not as weak as we've been led to believe. You sacrificed yourself for my daughter and her child. I owe you a debt." Ethan wasn't sure how to respond. The idea that the Queen owed him something felt strange. He had simply done what was instinctive, what any person would have done to protect someone in danger. Yet here he was, standing in front of the most powerful ruler of the Zarithian people, and she was speaking of debt and honor. "I didn't expect anything in return," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I only wanted to help." The Queen's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "That is what makes you different from the others," she said softly. "Most would have hesitated, but you acted without thought. It is rare among your kind." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He had been raised to believe that helping others was just part of being human. It wasn't a special thing, just something that people did because it was right. But the Queen saw it as something more, something that made him worthy of her attention, perhaps even her respect. "I have a proposition for you," the Queen continued, her tone more serious now. "The war we fight here is one of survival. And your actions, your courage, have earned you a place among us. I wish to offer you a role in the future of my people." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. A role? He wasn't sure if he was ready for anything like that. He was just a soldier, trained to follow orders, not to lead or change the course of history. But as he looked into the Queen's golden eyes, he realized that his life had changed forever. Whether he liked it or not, he was no longer just a human soldier in a faraway galaxy. He was now a part of something much larger. "What kind of role?" Ethan asked cautiously, his voice laced with uncertainty. "You will become my champion," the Queen said, her voice filled with an authority that left no room for argument. "You will fight alongside my warriors, lead them, and protect my people. You will serve as an example of the strength I wish to see in my people, strength that goes beyond mere brutality. You will show them what true courage means." Ethan's mind raced. The thought of becoming a champion to the Queen was both overwhelming and terrifying. He had no experience in leading an army or commanding warriors. He had been trained to fight and to survive, not to inspire an entire people. "I'm not a leader," he said quietly. "I'm just a soldier." The Queen's eyes softened just a fraction. "You are more than that," she said. "I see it in you, the strength, the compassion, the will to protect. You are the kind of leader my people need, and I believe you can help them change." Ethan was silent for a long time, weighing her words. Could he really do this? Could he lead Zarithian warriors, beings who had been raised on a code of conquest and dominance? He wasn't sure, but something deep inside him told him that this might be his only chance to make a real difference. "You have much to learn, but I believe you will rise to the challenge," the Queen continued, her voice firm but encouraging. "You will train with my warriors, learn their ways, and adapt to this new life. And when the time comes, you will fight for my people." Ethan hesitated, then nodded slowly. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't go back. There was no turning away from this now. The path he had chosen was uncertain and dangerous, but it was his path. "I'll do it," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I'll fight for you, for your people, but I'll do it on my terms." The Queen's smile widened, and for the first time Ethan saw something like warmth in her eyes. "I expected nothing less from you, human. We shall begin at once." And with that, Ethan Carter, the human soldier who had once been just another member of a peacekeeping force, found himself standing at the beginning of a new chapter in his life. He had chosen to fight, not just for survival, but for something greater. And as the Queen's champion, he would soon learn that the galaxy was a much bigger, more dangerous place than he could have ever imagined. The days following Ethan's agreement to serve as the Queen's champion were filled with grueling trials, lessons, and harsh realities. He spent his time training with Zarithian warriors, learning their combat techniques and adjusting to their brutal ways of fighting. At first, everything seemed impossible. Their strength, their speed, everything about them was built for war. And here he was, a human, trying to keep up. Ethan's body ached from the constant training. Every muscle in his body was sore, every joint screamed in pain after hours of combat drills. The Zarithians showed no mercy, pushing him to his limits every single day. At first, he struggled to even hold his own in sparring matches, his human body weaker compared to the towering Zarithian warriors. They were faster, stronger, and had years of experience. But Ethan's determination never faltered. He couldn't afford to fail, not now. Despite the physical toll, Ethan slowly began to adapt. His training with weapons was improving. He had been taught how to wield Zarithian blades, which were longer and sharper than anything he had used before. He learned to fight with both strategy and aggression, drawing from his military training. Each day he improved, and with each improvement, he gained a little more respect from the Zarithians around him. It was not just his strength that was being tested. The Queen had made it clear that being her champion meant more than just winning battles. Ethan was expected to embody the ideals of Zarithian strength and honor, even if he didn't fully understand what those meant. The first time he had been assigned to lead a group of Zarithian warriors in a real mission, he had felt the weight of the Queen's trust. The mission had been to clear a small rebel faction that had been causing trouble near the borders of their territory. Ethan had been nervous, but the warriors under his command showed no fear. They respected him because the Queen did. Ethan learned quickly that leadership among the Zarithians was earned, not given. The warriors respected strength, both physical and mental. They didn't care about rank or titles. The only thing that mattered was who could lead them to victory, and while Ethan had never thought of himself as a leader, he was learning to command. The mission was a success, though the fighting had been intense. Ethan had led the charge, and his strategies had proven effective. His team had cleared the rebel faction, but not without casualties. Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of their deaths on his conscience. Each time one of the Zarithian warriors fell, he had to remind himself that he was doing what needed to be done. But it was never easy. After the battle, the Queen had summoned him. Ethan had expected praise, perhaps even gratitude, but what he received was something else entirely. The Queen's golden eyes had regarded him with a piercing intensity, studying him as though she were examining something delicate, something precious. "You led them well," she had said, her voice steady and cold. "But you are not yet ready." Ethan had been taken aback. "Not ready for what?" The Queen had stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. "You are not yet ready to carry the burden of leadership. You fight well, human. But your heart is still tied to weakness." Ethan had bristled at the comment. "Weakness?" he had repeated, his voice sharp. "Yes, you are still too human," the Queen had said, almost as if it were a curse. "You care too much for the lives of others. In battle, that is your greatest strength and your greatest weakness." Ethan had been silent, trying to understand her words. He didn't feel weak. He felt driven, focused. He had done what was necessary to protect those around him. But to the Queen, it seemed that the value of life was something to be tossed aside in favor of victory. "You must harden yourself," the Queen had continued. "If you are to lead my people, you must stop thinking like a human. You must think like a Zarithian." Her words had stung more than he cared to admit, but Ethan knew there was some truth in them. His compassion, his willingness to sacrifice was part of who he was. But if he was going to lead these warriors, he couldn't allow his emotions to get in the way. He had to become something more, something different. As the days went on, Ethan found himself walking a fine line between maintaining his humanity and adapting to the brutal world of the Zarithians. He spent hours meditating, training his mind to push aside the feelings of guilt that arose whenever a warrior fell. It wasn't easy. Each time he looked into the eyes of his fallen comrades, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was responsible. He had led them into battle, and now they were gone. But there was no time to mourn, not for a Zarithian warrior, and not for Ethan. He had to push forward. Then one day, during a routine training session, Ethan was summoned to the Queen's chambers once more. This time, there was an urgency in her voice that set his nerves on edge. When he arrived, the Queen was standing near the window, her back to him. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room, and the light made her gold and crimson robes gleam. She didn't turn to face him immediately, and for a moment Ethan wasn't sure if he was supposed to speak or remain silent. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but heavy with an unspoken weight. "There is a new threat," she said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "A force has appeared on the borders of our territory. I've been reluctant to act, but it seems we have no choice. We must prepare for war." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had known the galaxy was filled with danger, but he hadn't expected it to come so soon, so violently. The peace he had fought for in his own world seemed so far away now. Here in this alien place there was only war. "A new threat?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. "What kind of force?" The Queen turned to face him then, her golden eyes burning with intensity. "An army of unknown origin. We don't know who they are or where they came from, but they are heading straight for us. We cannot afford to wait any longer." Ethan's mind raced. A new enemy, one he knew nothing about. He had to be ready. But he wasn't sure how much more he could take. The pressure of being the Queen's champion weighed heavily on him, and he wasn't sure if he was truly prepared to lead these warriors into battle against an unknown foe. "The warriors are ready," the Queen said, reading his thoughts. "But I need you, Ethan. You are my champion. You must lead them to victory." Ethan felt a surge of determination rise in his chest. This was it. The moment he had been preparing for. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a leader, and he had a duty to protect these people, just as he had protected Althara and Rylea. "I'll lead them," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "I won't fail you." The Queen's gaze softened ever so slightly. "I trust you, Ethan. You have proven yourself more than capable." With those words, Ethan knew that this battle would be the ultimate test of everything he had learned. There would be no turning back. He was no longer just a human soldier. He was the champion of the Zarithian Queen, and the weight of that title would stay with him forever. As he walked out of the Queen's chambers ready to face whatever threat awaited, he couldn't help but feel the crushing weight of responsibility. The fate of the Zarithians, and possibly even his own, now rested on his shoulders. And there was no turning back. The morning after the Queen's summons, Ethan found himself standing at the head of a massive army. The Zarithians, with their towering figures and battle-worn armor, lined up before him, ready for the war that loomed on the horizon. Their eyes were filled with determination, and though they had seen countless battles, there was an air of uncertainty that hung over them. This was different. This was something new, something unknown. Ethan stood tall in front of them, his mind racing. He had spent weeks training, adapting to the Zarithian way of combat, but this was unlike anything he had faced before. He was a soldier, yes, but now he was a leader. His every decision, every order would determine whether they lived or died. The weight of it pressed down on him, but he couldn't show it. Not now. Not in front of these warriors who had already begun to look to him for guidance. The sun was rising, casting long shadows over the battlefield that lay ahead. Ethan's heart pounded as he surveyed the landscape. He could feel the tension in the air. The enemy was out there, somewhere. But where? How many were they? What kind of weaponry did they have? These were the questions that kept Ethan up at night. But now, as the leader of this army, he had no time for doubt. The Zarithian warriors were already preparing, sharpening weapons and checking armor. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, their actions quick and efficient. And yet they were all looking to him now. He had spent countless hours learning their combat tactics, understanding their ways, but none of that could prepare him for this. Leading an army wasn't just about strategy. It was about knowing your soldiers, understanding their fears, and being able to inspire them when it mattered most. Ethan had never considered himself a leader, but now he had no choice. He turned to the captain of the Zarithian warriors, a grizzled veteran named Karak. His face was weathered, his body marked by scars from countless battles, but his eyes were sharp. He was the kind of warrior who had earned his place through strength, but even Karak now stood beside him, waiting for Ethan's command. "You're ready, Ethan," Karak said in his low, gravelly voice. "Don't doubt yourself. The Queen believes in you, and so do we." Ethan nodded, though his stomach churned. "I'll do my best," he said, though he knew that wasn't enough. His best might not be enough to save them all. Karak placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's all any of us can do. Now let's win this war." With those words, Ethan took a deep breath and turned back toward the battlefield. The enemy was closing in, and they had no time to waste. He had to act. He had to lead. They marched for hours, moving across the rugged terrain, their boots kicking up dust as they advanced. The Zarithians moved in tight formations, their weapons gleaming in the light. Ethan kept his eyes fixed ahead, scanning the horizon for any signs of the enemy. His mind was sharp, his training kicking in. He had been a soldier long enough to recognize the calm before the storm. Then, as they neared the valley where they expected the enemy to make their stand, the ground seemed to tremble. The air grew thick with tension. The Zarithians were no longer walking in silence. They were on high alert, each of them aware that they were about to face something more dangerous than they had ever encountered. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. He had led them here, but he couldn't lead them to victory alone. He had to rely on them. The warriors, their strength, their experience, they were the ones who would carry the day, but even with that there was still doubt. The unknown enemy had an advantage. They had the element of surprise. Ethan could feel it in the air. "We need to be ready for anything," Ethan said, his voice firm though his insides were anything but calm. "Stay sharp, trust each other." Karek gave him a curt nod and passed the order along to the rest of the warriors. They all nodded in return, their faces set in grim determination. As they reached the edge of the valley, Ethan ordered his forces to halt. He dismounted from his own mount and moved to the front. From here, he could see the enemy advancing. The figures were still far off, but their movements were unmistakable. They were closing in fast. The enemy was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. They were humanoid, but their bodies were cloaked in strange, shifting armor that seemed to ripple in the sunlight. They moved with a kind of grace that reminded him of predators stalking their prey. They were fast and they were numerous. "They've got us outnumbered," Karek muttered, his voice low. Ethan clenched his jaw. "We've been outnumbered before." The enemy was now within range. Ethan could feel the tension mounting. The warriors around him were ready, their weapons raised, eyes locked on the advancing force. Ethan's hand gripped the hilt of his blade. This was it, the moment of truth. "Prepare for battle," he shouted, his voice cutting through the silence like a whip. The Zarithians sprang into action, their battle cries filling the air. Ethan didn't hesitate. He moved with them, his mind focused. The first wave of enemies crashed into their lines like a tidal wave, and the battlefield erupted into chaos. Blades clashed, weapons rang out, and the sound of battle echoed across the valley. Ethan fought with everything he had. His body moved on instinct, his mind calculating every move, every strike. But there was no time to think. There was only action. He had led these warriors here, and now it was up to him to make sure they survived. He fought alongside Karek, cutting through enemy after enemy with ruthless precision. The Zarithians were strong, their bodies made for combat, but even they were struggling against the sheer numbers of the enemy. Ethan's heart raced as he fought, sweat pouring down his face. His side ached from the wounds he had sustained in the earlier battles, but he pushed through the pain. He couldn't afford to show weakness now. In the midst of the fighting, he spotted the Queen's standard bearer, a young warrior named Zara. She was holding the Queen's banner high, her eyes wide with determination. But she was surrounded. The enemy was closing in on her, and if she fell, the morale of the entire army would crumble. Without thinking, Ethan charged toward her, slicing through the enemy forces with his blade. He fought his way through the chaos, pushing forward, until he reached Zara's side. He grabbed her by the arm and pulled her back toward the safety of their lines. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice low. Zara nodded, her face pale but determined. "I won't leave the Queen's banner." Together they fought their way back to the front. The enemy was relentless, but the Zarithians were holding strong. Ethan could feel the tide of battle slowly beginning to turn. Their warriors were starting to push back. Slowly but surely they were gaining ground. But just as Ethan thought they had a chance, a new threat emerged. From behind the enemy's lines, a massive war machine appeared, its form towering over the battlefield. It was a monstrous, mechanical beast, its massive claws scraping the earth as it advanced toward them. The Zarithians faltered, fear flashing in their eyes. Ethan could see it in their faces. This was something none of them had expected. A new weapon, a new terror, but there was no time for fear. "Form up," Ethan shouted, rallying the warriors around him. "We fight together, we'll take it down." The warriors nodded, their eyes burning with resolve. They knew what they had to do. They weren't just fighting for survival now. They were fighting for everything. The battle raged on, but Ethan knew that this was the moment. They would either win or die trying. And no matter what happened, he would lead them to the end. He wouldn't back down. He couldn't. With the Zarithians at his side, Ethan charged once more, ready to face whatever came next.